Howdy folks, this video is about feature stories, kind of explaining what they are and how we might go about starting to write them. So a feature story really is a focus on what a thing is rather than what happened. That's kind of the big difference between like news and features. I want to be explaining kind of the details of what makes a person or a thing tick, what makes them interesting, not just what happened to them. What happened to them is news, who they are is a feature. So some options for feature writing. These are really wide open. They give us a lot of different things that we could potentially talk about as a class. So the first one is personality profiles, just finding someone interesting who does interesting things. People who play sports, people who've made the news, people with unusual interests or hobbies. Anybody has something that's interesting about them. And so it's your job to interview that person and kind of let that personality shine through. Um, Second type of feature story is a human interest story. It's basically showing a subject's oddity or emotional value or entertainment value, right? So this could be a story about someone who plays the kazoo for people in, I don't know, a children's hospital, right? Just to be silly and to brighten people's day, right? That's not really news. I don't need to know that, but it's a little bit out there and it's kind of got some emotional and entertaining value. I think that interesting. So think about anything out of the ordinary that would make someone kind of stand out, make them unique. That could qualify as a human interest story. Trend stories are really, really great too. They examine people, things, or organizations and how they have impacted our society. So basically, if high schoolers are doing it or saying it or listening to it or talking about it, it's a trend story. We could be reporting on that. So think about how students are using social medias or different apps or different technology or places that they hang out, right? Those are all trends. In-depth reaction stories are kind of a byproduct of a basic news story. So usually something will happen and we'll write that news story like, hey, this happened. And then if I want to go in depth in terms of finding out maybe why and how people reacted to this event, we might do sort of a detailed account beyond just explaining what happened. So this could be, the impact of school shootings that we see around the country from time to time, right? One hasn't happened to senior high or in Billings Public Schools, but I'm betting our students have some reactions and some feelings about those when they see it happen in other places. And then our last one is kind of a backgrounder or analysis piece, and it's adding meaning to the news by adding further explanation of here's how it kind of affects the people around us, or here's some effects of an idea on society. So vaping or homework, right? I could be doing some background about here's how students view vaping, here's what the importance of doing homework is or isn't, right? We could take these in any way. So how we're going to organize feature stories is number one, we need to define our subject. I can't just pick someone and say, hey, I'm going to do an article about Sally. That is way too difficult to write about. You can't tell me everything about Sally's life and make it interesting. So you're going to be able to get it a lot more specific. So maybe Sally likes baking, and through conversation, you really find out that Sally uses baking to relax after school because she gets really stressed out by homework, and turns out chocolate chip cookies are not very stressful at all. That would be a great way to define your subject. And secondly, you want to identify a message. This isn't really going to be your opinion, but it's kind of the point of telling a story. Why are you telling me this story about Sally and her baking? And so you kind of have to look like an author or a poet, where you're going to try to find a kind of a theme or something that kind of represents, here's what this story is about. So maybe that's how people change, or maybe how that's people grow, or that's maybe how people show their commitment or their passion for an idea, or maybe it's how they kind of break and relax, right? Any of these types of messages could be useful in a feature story. And then we're going to outline it. And really think of these as a story that you're telling me, right? So there's this narrative arc where you're introducing me a character, you're telling me details and facts and observations about them to kind of make this overall point, to make a message and really define, here's what you need to know about this person, here's why they're interesting. So we're going to do that by defining kind of what's called a nut graph. So a nut graph is basically the thesis of your story. It's the summary of your story. what NutGraph stands for is nutshell paragraph. So it's your article in a nutshell in one paragraph, but usually that paragraph is boiled down to a sentence or two. Um, and so what this is going to do for a feature story is like maybe you're going to start off with an artistic lead, description, a narrative, and then you're going to drop in your nut graph. You're going to say, hey, here is the summary of what my story is actually about. It's the thesis of my feature writing. It clarifies those 5 W's: who, what, when, where, how. Let me show you an example. So here's my here's my example of a nut graph, and it's this highlighted portion down here. So varsity football coach Seamus Shift loves to joke with his players. So earlier this month, when he told the varsity team a woman would be replacing him as a head coach, the players laughed. But when he didn't laugh, we knew it was true. Varsity quarterback junior Emmanuel Dyson said, so I'm starting with a little narrative, like telling me this little story about like, hey guys, I'm retiring. I'm going to be replaced by a girl. Your next coach is going to be a woman. And the players are like, ha, yeah, right. We wouldn't have a female for a coach. And the coach is like, actually, you're going to, which is kind of a cool. And so this sentence right here shows me, or this paragraph right here shows me the who, what, when, where, why, and how of this story, right? All I would need to do to understand really what's going on is read this nutshell paragraph. Everything else is going to be extra details and information that's going to be entertaining and informative, but this paragraph, these couple of sentences are the most important. So the general structure for this writing feature stories, it's going to be, I'm going to have some sort of lead to grab my audience's attention. My next paragraph is going to be explaining, here's the focus, here's the thesis and message of my story. And then I'm going to start going through that that inverted pyramid, right? When we think about, okay, I'm going to start with my most important information, then go down to my next important, next important, next important. And all the while, I do what's called quote leapfrog, where I'm going to give some information and I'm going to have a quote about it. And then I'm going to give some information and I'm going to have a quote about it. And sometimes I just kind of order my quotes saying, here's what I know I want to pull out of my interview as a direct quote from what this person said. And then I just find interesting and cohesive ways to connect these quotes and transition from one to the other in a way that kind of builds that story. That's the best way that I've kind of found to write paragraphs. So, okay, last one, we're going to see if you can remember what these are. What is the inverted pyramid? What's the SNP test? And what's a standard lead? If you can answer those questions from the previous video, do so in your notes right now. You're doing great. Good luck, folks.